Even as we celebrate all that we have in common, we know that in too many corners of the world we see violence and terror of those who would destroy rather than build. These are particularly difficult times in the Middle East. In Syria, the Assad regime continues its brutality against the Syrian people, and so we continue to help Syrians stand up to Assad and deal with the humanitarian crisis and push back against extremists. In Iraq, where ISIL's attacks on civilians and destruction of religious sites seek to inflame sectarian tensions, we continue to call for a new government that can unite Iraqis and show all communities in Iraq that they can advance their aspirations through the political process. Separately, the pictures we are seeing in Gaza and Israel are heart-wrenching. People here in the United States care deeply about what's happening there, and I know there's strong views as well as differences about how we should move forward, which is part of American democracy. We welcome that debate. That makes us stronger. Our goal has been and continues to be peace and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. Now, I will say very clearly, no country can accept rockets fired indiscriminately at citizens. And so we've been very clear that Israel has the right to defend itself against what I consider to be inexcusable attacks from Hamas. At the same time, on top of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza that we've worked long and hard to alleviate, the death and injury of Palestinian civilians is a tragedy, which is why we've emphasized the need to protect civilians, regardless of who they are or where they live. I believe further escalation benefits no one, least of all the Israeli and the Palestinian people. So we're going to continue doing everything we can to facilitate a return to the 2012 ceasefire. We are encouraged that Egypt has made a proposal to accomplish this goal, which we hope can restore the calm that we've been seeking. More broadly, however, the situation in Gaza reminds us again that the status quo is unsustainable and that the only path to true security is a just and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians, where differences are resolved peacefully and in ways that respect the dignity of all people.
The burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, saith the Lord, which stretcheth forth the heavens and layeth the foundation of the earth and formeth the spirit of man within it. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it.
There are great risks in what is happening there and in the potential of an even greater escalation of violence. We don't want to see that. Nobody does. Nor does Israel.
Daha başka bir şey söylemeyi gereksiz görüyorum. Olanları görmüyor.
Israel does not see, doesn't feel, doesn't hear what's happening. Israel is acting like a spoiled child, as you can see from the media today. Tanks on one side spreading death, while they, on the other side, dance in happiness.
Uluslararası hukuku çiğneyerek.
By disregarding international law and disregarding human rights, Israel continues to be a terrorist state, and nobody except us tells them to stop. You can be certain that systematic oppression, massacre, and intent to commit genocide, which has been going on in Palestine since 1948, will not go unpunished.
Keep not thou silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. The tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites, of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal, and Ammon, and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre, Asser also has joined with them. They hope in the children of Lot. Selah.
הייתה ונותרה. If Hamas rejects the Egyptian proposal and the rocket fire from Gaza does not cease, and that appears to be the case now, we are prepared to continue and intensify our operation to protect our people.
Thank you, gentlemen. Tודה רבה. Dankeschön.
Seek ye the Lord, all ye meek of the earth, which have brought his judgment. Seek righteousness, seek meekness. It may be ye shall be hid in the day of the Lord's anger. For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon a desolation. They shall drive out Ashdod at the noonday, and Ekron shall be rooted up. Woe unto the inhabitants of the sea coast, the nation of the Kerethites. The word of the Lord is against you. O Canaan, the land of the Philistines, I will even destroy thee, that there shall be no inhabitant. And the sea coast shall be dwellings and cottages for shepherds, and folds for flocks. And the coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah. They shall feed thereupon. In the houses of Ashkelon shall they lie down in the evening. For the Lord their God shall visit them, and turn away their captivity.
والذي استباح كل المحرمات.
مرة أخرى يشهد العالم
Once again, the world witnesses the reality of the Israeli occupation. Once again, the world witnesses the barbarity of this racist regime, which doesn't hesitate to commit war crimes against humanity, killing hundreds, wounding thousands, and destroying houses and mosques.
وتدمير المنازل وتدمير المساجد.
لسنا إزاء حرب بين جيشين وليس حربا ضد حركة.
It's not a war between two armies, and not a war against Hamas, but it's a war against all Palestinian people, against their rights. So for that, President Mahmoud Abbas has sent a message to the General Secretary of the UN asking officially to put the Palestinian territories under international protection.
فيها رسميا وضع أرض دولة فلسطين تحت الحماية الدولية.
تجري مصر اتصالاتها التي يعقبها.
Egypt will begin its exchanges, and that will be followed by the negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis in order to ensure the ceasefire and build trust and to give guarantees to Egypt to commit to what was agreed.
Whoa!
Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they carried away captive the whole captivity, to deliver them up to Edom. But I will send a fire on the wall of Gaza, which shall devour the palaces thereof. And I will cut off the inhabitant from Ashdod, and him that holdeth the scepter from Ashkelon, and I will turn mine hand against Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish, saith the Lord God.
Israeli military now confirming it shot down a drone launched from Gaza, marking the first time it has faced such a weapon in the current conflict with the terror group Hamas. Israel especially concerned because drones can evade Israel's sophisticated Iron Dome missile defense system and inflict casualties. Still, the rockets from Gaza keep coming, night and day, 24/7, targeting the Israeli homeland. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he will use any means necessary to stop the attacks. Backing up that threat, Israeli tanks and troops massing along the Gaza border, ready to invade if the order is given. KT McFarland, our Fox News national security analyst, with me now in studio, and good morning to you. First, Prime Minister Netanyahu from yesterday on this.
Here's the difference between us. We're using missile defense to protect our civilians, and they're using their civilians to protect their missiles. That's basically the difference. They're embedding these rockets that they're firing wholesale into our cities, terrorist rocketing, trying to kill as many as they can.
React to that and also this report of the drone.
When I've been to Israel, and I've been to the units where the pilots are, the Israeli pilots who, in an attack, would have to go bomb the areas where the Hamas missiles are, and they have said that every time they go, they get intelligence on the ground. They know if it's an apartment building, for example, where their people are. They drop flyers into that apartment building, into that neighborhood, saying, "Get out! We're going to destroy that building." They give the kind of warning to the civilians to get out. Hamas isn't doing that when they're firing rockets into Israel. They're trying to, hit, although not very successfully, trying to hit civilian areas.
A little more on that point. John McCain from Sunday talking about that very thing also.
Israel is being attacked by hundreds of rockets. Their people, a third of their population, has got about a 60-second warning. Picture the United States of America with a country contiguous to ours that we're being subjected to rocket attacks. So the restraint of the Israelis, in my view, is admirable.
He went on to say because there haven't been more Israeli casualties isn't because Hamas has not tried.
Oh, they've tried. They're just not very good at it. But the difference is, Bill, this is a cycle that we see every couple of years. It's a cycle where Palestinians provoke, Israel responds, Palestinians lob some rockets into Israel, Israel destroys the rocket sites. Everybody sort of takes a deep breath. It happens again a few years later when the Palestinians decide to provoke it. Palestinians get resupplied. Who do they resupply from? Iran. I think Iran has a much bigger footprint in this than anybody's willing to
Let me get to that. And also, they're getting supplies from Syria, too. We're now finding Syrian rockets that travel much further than they ever have before out of Gaza. You tweeted this morning, is this a diversion from the failed Iran nuclear talks? What do you mean by that?
Well, here's the thing. Why did the Palestinians provoke this crisis now? Why not a month ago? Why not 6 months from now? They provoked it by taking 3 teenagers and killing them. Why? What's the timing? At almost the same time that this Israeli-Palestinian crisis broke out, the supreme leader of Iran said, by the way, we're not dismantling any of our nuclear centrifuges. We need 10 times more than we already have. And that's at the same time that there are negotiations in Vienna now over Iran's nuclear program. I think that this was Iran telling its Hamas clients, why don't you cause a little problem over there so nobody notices what's really going on, which is Iran's nuclear program.
Well, okay, so that's going on now, and you got Secretary Kerry, who is negotiating this Iran deal that apparently is a bit tenuous at the moment. Perhaps to say the least, that might be an understatement. And there are those in the Middle East who are suggesting Secretary Kerry should stay away from the current conflict. Wasn't that part of the re-engagement a year ago this administration wanted to manage?
That was the thing. A year ago, the Secretary Kerry said his big objective in becoming Secretary of State was to solve the Palestinian-Israeli crisis once and for all. And he devoted a lot of attention and effort to it and was unsuccessful. I think he probably had his priorities misplaced. The biggest crisis in the Middle East, the biggest threat to world peace and to the region is if Iran gets nuclear weapons. And Iran has just shown the world that it is not going to dismantle its nuclear centrifuges, but the sanctions have been lifted. And the economic pressure on the part of the West and the United States businesses to lift those sanctions further will be overwhelming. At the end of the day, I don't think Iran needs a permanent deal. They got what they wanted in the first step, which is the U.S. would lift sanctions a little bit, and the rest of it, the market forces will take care of.
It's a lot to follow, but we will do our best with your help and your great experience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, KT.
It appears Hamas has issued a video on Al-Aqsa television, a Gaza television station, showing what it says is a drone used appearing there in the sky with rockets attached to it. Israel has not commented on the video, but on Monday, earlier in the day, Israel said it shot down a drone near the port city of Ashdod. It searched an area of 25 kilometers looking for potential explosives that may have been part of the drone. So far, no results from that search. Experts say, if confirmed, this would suggest that Hamas's arsenal is much bigger than many would have expected. And of course, also on Monday, the exchange of fire that now has become familiar to so many people entered its 7th day, 1 week now, just 1 day shorter than the 8-day offensive in 2012. More than 170 people dead. Officials in in Gaza and medical sources there saying most of them are civilian, believes in an airstrike, and if there is to be a ground incursion, a limited one, a quick entry and a quick exit. Now this is in contrast to what some Israeli ministers on Monday night are saying, one saying that the situation does not need a ceasefire, it needs the fire to be extinguished altogether.
Well, Rowie, the unrest is not just centered in Gaza. What's been going on in the West Bank?
Indeed, a 21-year-old Palestinian shot and killed, witnesses say, by Israeli soldiers in an exchange of fire. There have been growing clashes there as West Bank Palestinians express solidarity with Gazans and outrage over the Israeli airstrikes that we've been seeing for the last week. The 21-year-old Munir Ahmed Baradin was buried on Monday as relatives expressed their outrage. One mother, his mother actually, telling local media that children are dying, that blood is shed, and that the Arab leaders are doing nothing. And indeed, we've seen calls from some Arab leaders for tougher action. Egypt trying to get involved at some point, then stepping back. And on Tuesday, several key diplomats are arriving in the region, both the American Secretary of State John Kerry and also the former British Minister Tony Blair, who is arriving as the quartet's envoy. No doubt they'll be concerned not just by what's going on in Gaza, but also a possible spread of that violence to the West Bank.
Rowie Rettenberg reporting live from Tel Aviv. Thank you for that. The Palestinian foreign minister is calling for an immediate ceasefire. He's in Egypt, where an emergency Arab League meeting just convened on the conflict. The aim is to help in the unrest and to encourage the international community to pressure Israel. The Israeli military says it's launched more than 1,300 strikes on the Hamas-held Gaza Strip since Tuesday. Palestinian militants have fired nearly 1,000 rockets at Israel.
Dori Gold is a foreign policy advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and is live with us here on the Fox News deck this afternoon. It's nice to see you.
Good to be here.
I'm hearing a lot of pundits say today it looks like this is going to be quick, not last too long, with the aim of getting the rockets out of their hands. And I don't know how they are able to say this with 40,000 troops on the border.
Well, I think the point is to not look at an event like this with a stopwatch, but to look at the mission. And the mission is to bring to an end this constant rocket fire on Israel. You know, people of Israel are resilient, and they're supporting their government, they're supporting their army, because they want this to come to an end. And therefore, whatever is required, and how much ever time is required, I think the Prime Minister and his government will receive support.
You don't want casualties if you can avoid them. There's no way you want to send troops over the border if you don't have to. Is it starting to look like that's not going to be necessary?
You know, I wouldn't want to start, guessing and what do you call it, Monday morning quarterbacking the military moves that are necessary. We have a very serious problem. The Hamas has embedded its military capability inside the Palestinian population. So what do you do if you're Israel? Do you just say, okay, we're going to use massive firepower against Palestinians? We're not at war with the Palestinians, we're at war with Hamas. So you want to separate the military capability of Hamas from the Palestinians, and that's what that Israeli military strategy is right now working on.
Have you heard anything about a ceasefire?
Yeah, on television.
Yeah, I'm seeing it on television too, but I know there's talk of a ceasefire. In the past, ceasefires have delayed more than anything else. It sounds to me like what Israel wants to do this time is not ceasefire, but get in there and get rid of these rockets, because they're reaching Tel Aviv and Haifa's of particular interest for a number of reasons in ways that they haven't before.
Well, I think the Prime Minister uses the word sustainable, a sustainable ceasefire. And a sustainable ceasefire is not a ceasefire that leaves thousands of Iranian rockets sitting in place, ready to be used at the next crisis, or the next time Tehran wants them to put pressure on Israel. We're just not going to allow that kind of situation to continue.
People who say that those in Gaza have struck but killed no one, and the Israelis have killed 175 people, and those people would say this doesn't seem very fair to a people who are basically occupied. What do you say in response?
Well, hey, they're not occupied. Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip. We had hoped.
They're very well blocked.
Well, they may be, but that's not an occupation. And Israel had hoped that the Palestinians would use the opportunity of the Israeli withdrawal in 2005 to build a new society, to build a new country. They didn't do that. They invested instead in huge amounts of weaponry, and we could even see the rate of rocket fire increased on Israel after we withdrew.
And were the settlements not encroaching? Is it possible that the 3 Israelis would not be dead and this wouldn't have happened?
Well, there were no settlements in the Gaza Strip. There's no basis for Hamas to make any reference to settlements.
Well, the 3 kids were from a settlement. The 3 kids.
Oh, in the West Bank. But that's something else.
Yep.
But that was just pure murder. That was picking up, teenagers coming back from school, throwing them into a car, and killing them at the first opportunity.
And now it's your belief that Israel needs to get in and get rid of all of these rockets. That's going to be a difficult and life-costing endeavor.
Well, in parallel to that horrible act of Hamas in murdering those 3 Israeli teenagers, they began escalating rocket fire against Israel. So what is the Prime Minister of Israel supposed to do? Just sit back and take it? No, he has to protect his country, and he has to make sure that that huge rocket supply that exists in Gaza can't be used at will by Hamas anytime they want.
Doherty Gold, nice to see you again.
Pleasure.
All right.
It's a new call for peace in the Middle East. Egypt put forth a 3-step plan that includes a temporary ceasefire and talks between Israelis and Palestinians. At least 185 are dead in this latest fighting, and the air assaults continue. Israeli missiles, Hamas rockets, and now drones. CCTV's Rowie Ruttenberg has more from Tel Aviv.
This video released by Gaza's Al-Aqsa TV on Monday claims to show a Hamas drone in the sky. Note the rockets attached. Israel, which hasn't commented on the video, said it shot down an unmanned drone near the port of Ashdod earlier in the day. It's the first time an unmanned aircraft appears to have been used by Palestinians in the conflict. And observers say it reveals that Hamas's arsenal may be more advanced than some had suspected. Despite the threat, Israel says its offensive, now 1 week in, is going well.
So far, we have destroyed about 1,500 targets, including weapons and around 150 homes of Hamas commanders, and also those of Islamic Jihad, tunnels, organizational offices, governmental institutions, financial institutions, and their assets. So we can absolutely say that Hamas and the other terror organizations pay a heavy price. They will pay a very heavy price for taunting us.
The U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is due in the region on Tuesday. So too is the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Both men say their aim is to achieve a ceasefire. One prominent Israeli cabinet minister saying on Monday it'd be better to extinguish the fire altogether. Rowie Ruttenberg, CCTV, Tel Aviv.
There is also breaking news now on the standoff in the Middle East. Israel resuming airstrikes in Gaza. Israel agreeing to a proposed ceasefire with Hamas, but Hamas rejecting that offer and only minutes later started firing their rockets yet again. Now the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli military stepping up the attacks against Hamas. Where does this go? Good morning, and I'm Bill Hemmer. Welcome here to America's Newsroom. Busy already. Morning, Martha.
It sure is. Good morning, Bill. Good morning, everybody. I'm Martha McCallum. So despite the growing international pressure for a ceasefire, the Hamas rockets continue today, and Israel continuing to respond in kind. Now, the violence has spilled into the streets outside Jerusalem. Forces firing tear gas to disperse the people protesting the Israeli military operation.
David Lee Miller live in southern Israel now. Does the ceasefire have any chance, or is that forgotten now, David Lee?
Well, Bill, it's really too soon to tell if this ceasefire agreement should be relegated to the trash bin of history. But as of this hour, it is certainly not taking hold. The militants in Gaza never ceased their fire once the ceasefire officially began at 9 o'clock this morning, local time. And just a short time ago, Israel resumed its airstrikes. The military here says Hamas militants, since the ceasefire was supposed to get underway, have fired at least 60 rockets into Israel. Just moments ago, before we went on the air, one of them intercepted directly overhead. Another earlier landing on a home here in southern Israel, causing damage. There were no injuries. Israel is now in the process of implementing what would be their 9th battery of Iron Dome interceptors. As for Hamas, perhaps it's unfair to say that they rejected this ceasefire bill. Some of the Hamas leadership in Gaza is saying that it never even received a draft of this ceasefire that was brokered by the Egyptians. The military wing saying that it is simply not worth the ink that was used to write it. But if there is cause for any optimism, The Hamas leadership in exile says that, quote, internal consultations still continue about whether or not to accept this ceasefire. But at this hour, I can tell you, the violence continues. But we have to remember, Bill, that this ceasefire officially began at 9 a.m. It had a 12-hour de-escalation period at 9 o'clock tonight. That's when arguably both parties, if they continued to shoot, would be in violation. That's the part of the agreement that perhaps some could argue is reason for optimism, but that's increasingly open to question.
If this were to go to another level, David Lee, Israel would invade the Gaza Strip yet again. How real is that possibility now?
That is a possibility. I won't say a very real possibility. Moments ago, the head of the Southern Command here gave an interview, and he's the general in charge of what would be a ground incursion, saying that he is now endorsing some type of limited ground incursion into Gaza. That would be an incursion that could last between 1 and 2 weeks. It would not be full-blown. They would not move into Gaza City. The purpose of this incursion, Bill, would be for the military to destroy the infiltration tunnels that Hamas has built for its operatives to illegally enter Israel and commit acts of sabotage and mayhem. But right now, that incursion still on the table. We're waiting to see if this ceasefire is going to take hold. The Prime Minister here, the best way to describe him, cautiously optimistic.
And the rockets continue. David Lee Miller, thank you. Live in southern Israel on that, leading our coverage there. Martha.
Well, back here at home, the White House is calling on both sides to cease fire.
We need Hamas to stop launching rockets that are putting Israeli citizens in harm's way. Now, at the same time, the United States is also very concerned about those Palestinian civilians who are in harm's way.
Doesn't look like any of that is having much impact at this point. The White House goes on to say that it's urging both sides to do everything necessary to keep civilians on each side of the border safe. President Obama is pushing for the two sides to come back to the negotiating table. That seems to be nowhere at this point.
The deadly air assaults continue in the Middle East. In 8 days of attacks on Gaza, nearly 200 Palestinians have died. On Tuesday, Israel confirmed its first death in this latest conflict. A man was killed by a mortar at the Erez crossing in northern Gaza. Israeli police say he was delivering food to soldiers stationed at the border, where they are on standby in case of a ground offensive into Gaza. A ground operation may still be an option. Israel initially agreed on Tuesday to a ceasefire plan proposed by Egypt. But after the military wing of Hamas refused to abide, Israel resumed its airstrikes. Martin Fletcher has more now from Tel Aviv.
At 7 a.m. local time, Israel's Security Cabinet met and decided to accept the Egyptian truce proposal, but Hamas rejected it. Its military wing said it would intensify its fighting, saying that nobody had spoken to them directly. Israel's army, poised on the edge of Gaza, woke up to the news that a ground invasion was off for the time being. The government had accepted a ceasefire, but it won't be one-sided.
If Hamas rejects the Egyptian proposal and the rocket fire from Gaza does not cease, and that appears to be the case now, we are prepared to continue and intensify our operation to protect our people.
And Hamas did reject it. Overnight, before the truce deadline, 2 rockets hit Israel's Red Sea resort, Eilat, wounding 4 people. While Israeli troops pounded Hamas targets in Gaza, killing 2, bringing the total of Palestinian dead to 194, most of them civilians. This morning in Gaza, residents picked their way through the ruins. Israel has destroyed more than 1,000 buildings, targeting, it says, Hamas locations like rocket launching sites, secret tunnels, and the homes of militant leaders. But they have been in hiding, below ground, unhurt, and, according to their spokesman this morning, ready to fight on. Hamas fired more than 58 rockets at Israel after the ceasefire should have started at 9 a.m. local time. Israel took it for 6 hours before hitting back with what the army calls full force. Now it appears the ceasefire is over before it began.
Proposal for peace quickly unravels in the Middle East. Israel and Hamas firing back at each other after a ceasefire deal falls apart. It is the second hour of Happening Now. Welcome. I'm John Scott.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jenna Lee. Hope you're off to a great day so far. One of our big stories today, the Israeli military keeping its vow to hit Gaza hard if Hamas rejected that deal. Well, there you see some of what's happening today along the Israel-Gaza border. Plumes of heavy smoke rising over the Gaza Strip as Israel resumed its airstrikes. Israel had stopped those strikes for hours, agreeing to this Egyptian-led ceasefire, but Hamas rejected the deal, fired dozens of rockets, and it appears we're back to where we started. John Huddy's live in Gaza City with the latest. John?
Well, Jen and John, in terms of those rockets, we saw several, by our count 5, fired from a location, probably, if I had to guess, maybe 5 minutes, a 5-minute walk up the road here. Those rockets were fired earlier this afternoon in that same ceasefire agreement time frame. Israel stopped its firing, but Hamas did not, launching dozens of rockets at Israel, including the ones we saw just up the way here. And then it wasn't that much longer, a little bit after that, that there was a huge explosion, that Israel's Air Force hit that location with a missile strike. And let me tell you, John and Jenna, over the last couple of days that we've been here, we've seen and heard a lot of action in this area. Missile strikes, rocket launches, and today that has increased over the course of the last few hours, despite this potential and despite the Egyptian brokered ceasefire agreement that Israel accepted, at least for about 6 hours before resuming its operations. Hamas said it was never consulted, so it rejected the deal and instead fired a barrage of rockets at Israel, including some that were recently intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system over Tel Aviv, and others were intercepted in and around the southern Israeli and Gaza border area. And now, at this point, we're hearing about the first civilian casualty in Israel. Well, more than or close to 200 Palestinians have been killed throughout this conflict, more than 1,200 injured. Only several Israelis have been injured. There's been some damage. But tonight we hear that one person has died because of, according to officials, a Hamas mortar attack. So that's new. And really the question at this point, will that intensify? And the fact that these ceasefire brokered agreements broke down today, will that increase and intensify the fighting that we've already seen now for 8 days? That remains a serious question. And I can tell you, as we go into the evening and overnight hours, as we've seen before, the pattern is that things really pick up. And the question is, will that intensify? And also, will there be a ground offensive? We saw Israeli special forces teams on the ground over the weekend. And the question now, will we see that again? And more so, the fighting intensify. Jenna? John?
Our top story today, John, thank you.
Dozens of rounds of Israeli airstrikes hit Palestinian targets today. This after Egypt proposed a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Israel agreed, but the militants said no and continued raining rockets on Israel. So now Israel is vowing to step up its counterattacks. Rick Grinnell joins us now to discuss where this conflict goes from here. He has advised 4 U.S. ambassadors to the UN, and he is also a Fox News contributor. This is a movie that we have seen time and time again. How does this one end, Rick?
You know, who knows, but we've got to have something different. I mean, we can't continue on this cycle where rockets come over into Israel, Israel responds, there's a bunch of destruction, and then the Palestinians ask for some sort of international aid. There's a lot of U.S. taxpayer dollars going to rebuild and to try to change this equation inside Palestine. We've got to change it. And one thing that I want to point out, you just read that this is a peace deal brokered by Egypt. Egypt is one of the countries that classifies Hamas as a terrorist organization. So does Jordan, the EU, the US. This is the problem that the Palestinians have. Hamas governing Gaza is a terrorist organization, and yet they're a part of this government.
The Israelis occupied Gaza for all of those years, gave it back to the Palestinians to manage themselves, and this is the thanks they get?
Yeah, the Palestinians have a real serious problem with Hamas. They have to be able to have leadership. But you also have to feel for the many Palestinian people who want peace, because I think that there are many. They just don't have leaders. Israel doesn't have a peace partner, and I think this goes back to the dilemma for the Obama administration, is that they cannot be pressuring Israel alone when Palestinians, clearly the Palestinian government has the problem with Hamas.
We have a new government in Egypt. You know, Egypt has generally had, pretty good relations with Israel over the past couple of decades at least. They put forward this peace deal but don't tell the Israelis about it? Or don't consult with the Israelis about it?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a huge problem in the region for trying to have countries in the region really treat Israel fairly. And I think that what needs to happen is the Obama administration needs to look at the reality of the situation, and the United Nations as well. Israel doesn't have a peace partner. They don't have a lot of support, and this is a very tough region. So it's a big dilemma. Again, I go back. This is a problem for the Palestinian Authority. They need to decide, should Israel exist or should not? Because Hamas does not want Israel to even exist. How do you have a peace negotiation when the other side wants you to completely end and cease to exist?
So is there leverage that the United States has in terms of some of this rebuilding money? I mean, you say that we spend billions of dollars on the Palestinians and helping them, frankly, rebuild some of their infrastructure after these attacks.
How refreshing would it be if the United States government actually said, well, don't lob rockets into Israel, and you won't have these problems. If we actually came out and said there are consequences for your actions, and we are no longer going to give U.S. taxpayer dollars to rebuild, something might change.
Yeah, it's a good way to raise children. Consequences for your actions might work with the Palestinians. Rick Grinnell, thank you.
Thanks, John.
I think time's running out, frankly. Look, the Egyptian offer is a good offer. It's for a ceasefire by both parties. Then they come to Cairo for negotiations without preconditions. And the idea is to put in place a short-term ceasefire deal followed by a long-term plan that changes the game on the ground in Gaza, and both opens up opportunity for the Gazan people and gives Israel some long-term and permanent security. So it's a tragedy if this opportunity is not taken.
Is this the final word from Hamas? Because the Israelis accepted the Egyptian ceasefire proposal. They stopped their airstrikes, but after 6 hours of Hamas shelling into Israel, the Israelis resumed their operations. Is this a temporary operation that's going on, the continued fighting, or is Hamas in a day or two or longer going to reconsider?
It's hard to work out what the calculations of Hamas are, but the important thing is that if they really care about the people of Gaza, who have suffered terribly over these past days, I mean, almost 200 people that have died, many of them being completely innocent people, but this is inevitably going to be the case, and they know this if the violence continues. Now, you know, the Egyptians put forward this offer. I think the Egyptians showed great leadership in doing it. It was a sincere offer to sort the issues out, short-term and long-term. The Israelis accepted, and I really hope, even at this late stage, that Hamas understand that it's in the interests of the people of Gaza for this offer to be accepted, and then we can, you know, work out what is the way we open Gaza back up to the world, change the condition of its people, rebuild it, and unify Palestinian politics on the basis of something that promotes peace and gives Israel their guarantees on security, so that rockets aren't fired and terrorism and tunnels helping terrorism, so that's not aimed at Israel. I actually think a lot has been achieved in John Kerry's initiative. I think he got a lot of the basic issues, what we call the final status issues around territory and security and so on. I think he came a long way with that.
Why did it collapse?
I think ultimately we've got to understand that now to get peace, we're going to have to put the conditions for peace in place. And I think that the crucial thing is this. Whilst Palestinian politics is divided, it's very hard for peace to happen. One of the things that could arise out of a deal on Gaza is that we put in place a form of unity for Palestinian politics that actually unites people around a peaceful and not violent means towards a two-state solution. And the real issue, I think, is is there any hope that they will ever accept that, or are they going to remain in an armed struggle where they will kill Israeli civilians, in which case, you know, Palestinian politics then has to be given the opportunity to defeat that politics completely.
But of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief. Ye are all the children of light, and the children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober. For they that sleep, sleep in the night, and they that be drunken are drunken in the night.